Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes so people can join in the waiting room. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Emily Dittman. I'm the Associate Director at the Syracuse University Art Museum. And thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're very excited to have photographer Amy Elkins join us for an artist talk this afternoon. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now stands. As we get started this afternoon, just a few housekeeping notes. This is a Zoom meeting format, so we ask that you mute your microphones during the presentation. We'll open it up for a Q&A afterwards. Please also note that this presentation is being recorded, so if you would not like your, so please turn off your camera if you would not like to have your image on video. We do have closed captioning provided, and if you would like to have this, please make sure to click on the CC button at the bottom of the screen. Today, we are pleased to welcome Amy Elkins with a special introduction by our friend Doug Dubois, Associate Professor of Photography in the Department of Film and Media Arts here at Syracuse University. And with that, I will hand it over to Doug.
All right. Hello, everybody. Hello, Amy. So great to have you here in our class. My class is seated behind me, as you can see. And I have to arrange, I have a big screen projecting and I just have to give me a sec to get that organized and do a quick screen share for our intro. And hang on. Okay, I'm gonna share the screen. I think. If I do this right. Oh, wait a minute. I'm having a sharing glitch for projection here.
I'm trying to let you focus, but also loving the fact that we're circling back to this reuniting.
I know, that's not working. All right, so I have a glitch here.
Uh-oh.
And I'm gonna have to do it a different way, which is just going to be a little messier, but it doesn't let me share the screen I'm projecting. So I have to quickly recalibrate. I'm really sorry for the delay, folks.
That's okay by me.
Just give me a sec.
Doug, let us know if there's anything we can help on our end.
Just what I'm going to do. Oh, here we go. It should work now.
It's the trials and tribulations of Zoom.
I know. I'll try one more time to do the share. It's not recognizing the other screen. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. Oh, there it is. Okay, almost there. Okay, you should probably be seeing a gray screen. Is that true?
We see Jake.
Oh, you do?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, that's great because nobody else can see Jake in my class. Because it's not going up. See, I'm having okay. Hang on, I can fix this very quickly. So that works. Now you all see Jake. Yes, yes, yes.
I see.
Good. We see Jake. Yes.
Okay.
Are we good? And you're not seeing the rest of it? Just seeing
Well,
Jake?
we see.
You can see your files.
Just seeing my
Doug.
whole thing.
Yeah, your whole screen. Yeah, but
Yeah,
we see what we
that's
need
the
to see.
problem. I tried to be fancy here. And,
It's fine.
get a nice clean screen. So we're just going to do it this way. I'm going to just go sloppy, just so we can get going. So what I'd like to do by way of introduction is talk about the things I love and admire about Amy's work, which largely has to do with portraiture and how I encountered it and how I thought about it. It's going to be very brief, but I think might give you a sense of her work overall. And then Amy's going to take over and take it from there. So well before I met Amy Elkins in person, I had a postcard with, I think, this image on it, titled Jacob, Brooklyn, New York, 2006. It's from her Wallflower series of portraits depicting shirtless men gently posing in front of floral wallpaper. The title and backdrop is very clever, but what really struck me was their shy, wan postures, not feminine so much as unguarded and vulnerable in their shirtless masculinity. A singular feat, something I really hadn't quite seen. It's kind of jealous. And one question, we can talk about this later, Amy, but I'm like, what did you say to these men to get them to be so open? So that's a question I've always wondered. A few years later, I'll do this. Amy began a correspondence with 7 men incarcerated for life or awaiting execution on death row. Over a 7-year period, 2 of the men were killed by the state, a few dropped out, and 2 were released. 1 only after the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences given to juveniles under 18 were cruel and unusual. In 2016, Amy published a book of this work titled Black is the Day, Black is the Night. Amy never met nor photographed any of the men directly. Instead, she made imaginative use of the bold facts of their sentences and the poignant details of their correspondence to access what cannot be seen, their inner lives. This photograph titled 17/35, Not the Man I Once Was, portrait of a man 17 years into his death row sentence, where the ratio of years spent in prison to years alive determined the level of image loss. This poignant algorithm, more granular than any conventional portrait could be, quite literally depicts the man's dissolution as the balance of his sentence tips towards a life incarcerated. When one of the men Amy was corresponding with was executed in Texas, Amy took a hard look at the state's publicly available records of executions. Another portrait here. Since the Supreme Court overturned the federal ban on capital punishment in 1975, Texas is responsible for nearly 40% of all state executions in the US, details of which can be found on the Texas Departmental Criminal Justice website. Employing yet another algorithm, Amy reproduced the mugshots of 556 executed death row inmates using repeated text fragments from their final words recorded on the day of their murder by the state. An elegy, a chant, a death rattle. These words offer little about the men's lives, but speak volumes about the absolute certainty and finality of the criminal justice system that decides their fate. This image, Franklin Dwayne Alex, execution number 452. The text reads, "I am not the monster they made me out to be. I got peace in my heart." Most recently, Amy turned to herself during quarantine and lockdown over the first year of the pandemic. Anxious Pleasures is a series of 377 self-portraits begun in March 2020 and ending after Amy received her second dose of the vaccine in April 2021. Harking back at times to the Wallflower series while engaging the claustrophobic imaginings of her work on incarceration, the photographs are at once playful and deadly earnest. A book of this work will be published soon. You can pre-order it at Chris Gray's Projects in New York. Amy Elkins received her BFA in photography in the School of Visual Arts in New York City and is currently pursuing her MFA in art practice at Stanford University. She's been exhibited and published both nationally and internationally, including at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the Kunsthalle Wien in Vienna, Austria, the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson, Arizona, and many other venues. Her first book, Black is the Day, Black is the Night, won the 2017 Lucy Independent Book Award. It was shortlisted for the MAC First Book Award and the 2016 Paris Photo Aperture Foundation Book Prize. I think that's it. So Amy, welcome again to Syracuse. Amy also was a Lightwork resident in 2018. Is that right? No, 2017?
2011, so long ago.
2011, was it that long ago? Oh my
That
God.
long ago.
She exhibited there as well, which is a really fabulous exhibition with Jen Davis. So here we are again. All right, Amy. Over
Thanks
to you.
for the
I'm gonna
lovely
stop the
intro.
share.
Thanks for the lovely intro. I'm going to jump into my own share, and hopefully it'll all just go smoothly. You guys see one image, greetings from the West Coast? Yes, cool. I hate when you don't know if you can see all the other random stuff on an artist's desktop. First, I guess I wanted to quickly thank Doug and everyone at the museum for organizing this talk and just helping me make it smooth in conjunction with the show Persister, which if you're local is on display at the museum at Syracuse University. I wanted to additionally acknowledge for anyone who might be live streaming or watching this later, everyone at Newcomb Museum at Tulane University in New Orleans, who originally commissioned me to do the work that's up on display at Syracuse. And then of course, all of you for attending this talk, which will mostly focus on works surrounding mass incarceration in the United States. Yeah, I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to engage in this work and these topics. Doug might have known me long enough to maybe be familiar with this, but I first became interested in making work about mass incarceration when a close family member of mine was sentenced to several years in a federal prison in 2005. This might have been before I met Doug, but I quickly saw and felt very firsthand how this experience impacted not only my family, but myself, and had this ripple effect into like the community at large. It was pretty undeniable. But it wasn't until several years later that I actually had the language or the ability to explore that in a bigger way. This happened when I was an undergrad in New York. But before I dive into work about incarceration, which again will be like the main focus, I wanted to touch very briefly on portrait work I've made and continue to make surrounding maleness and masculinity and vulnerability, as Doug touched on, as I feel the topics of masculinity and mass incarceration are deeply intertwined. So going back to an image Doug shared, the first body of work that I made that specifically looked into male identity and masculine vulnerability was Wallflower, which I shot from 2005 to 2008. I was an undergrad at School of Visual Arts in New York. And this is a series of portraits of men that I photographed in the only space readily available to me as a young artist, which was my Brooklyn apartment. To make the portraits, I created these small sets out of floral backdrops, and I asked these men to sort of enter these spaces and simply sit bare before the lens. It's obviously more complicated than that, but for brevity, I was interested in what would occur in that space when one's maleness was placed within this staged domestic environment that's often associated with femininity. I was also interested in witnessing and portraying vulnerability and beauty of a population that I feel, and it's changing, I feel like it's changing, often is trained to deny these vulnerabilities and being associated like with such things from a perspective of female identifying individual who's often expected to be vulnerable and live up to societal beauty standards. So just sort of playing with these ideas of cultural norms placed on genders. I returned to making this work in 2016. So the original series, 2005 to 2008, I returned in 2016, but went about it quite a bit differently. Originally, I was scouting my local neighborhoods in Brooklyn, finding men just through acquaintances or in local spots that I frequented, and inviting them into my personal space. In 2016, I was doing some work in Tennessee and Atlanta that brought me to the American South, and I started thinking about working around masculine identity in the American South, but opening it up through open calls to invite strangers to invite me into their space. And that was open to anyone that was identifying as masculine, because in my first naive attempt of doing these portraits, I was very narrow scoped. And so in returning, I wanted to look at anyone identifying as masculine. And so the portraits shift from vertical to horizontal, cropping at the shoulders. And this is something that I did through a lot of experimentation with my sitters, but also it just sort of unfolded organically to change this framing, which would allow anyone that wanted to participate in the series to be a part of it and not feel excluded due to being uncomfortable. And so it crops the shoulders and it allows people in whatever transitional state, because a lot of the men that did sign up for these portraits were trans, to be comfortable sitting before the lens, no matter what else was going on in their personal lives that they didn't feel comfortable sharing. And that honestly is a work in progress, because I was supposed to go out in 2020 to shoot my third follow-up portrait with a lot of them, and COVID hit. And so it's been sort of epically delayed. Hopefully will happen next year or later this year. To backpedal a little, in 2009, I became interested in exploring other aspects of masculinity, including aspects of maleness often celebrated in our culture, which is athleticism, competition, aggression, and modes of play violence. Something that I've always been intrigued by from a feminine stance who's like afraid of violence. I spent 2 years going to Ivy League rugby matches on the East Coast when I was living in New York, and I would set up backdrops against the sidelines of the game and photograph these young men immediately after their matches had ended. And in doing this, I was still interested in portraying these sort of male posturings and vulnerabilities, but I was also really interested in this evidence of this brutal sport, right? And so I wanted to really study the body language, the facial expressions, and like what I think of as like attempted posturing, because they weren't quite able to hold the poses I imagine they wish they could if they weren't as physically and mentally exhausted. And these are all done within the safe arena that was created for people to play violent. So these are just a few tiny selections I'm just touching on from these earlier bodies of work, much of which led to my interest in exploring populations of men serving time behind bars, which majority of are there. Well, a lot of people are there for non-violent crimes, drug crimes, but a lot of people are there due to acting on similar impulses of competition and aggression. So I was interested in exploring that further, which led to Black as a Day, Black as a Night. So in 2009, while I was working with these college rugby players, I went on to work on this project, Black as a Day, Black as a Night, would span several years. And it just sort of ended up really opening my eyes to these really stark realities of juvenile incarceration, capital punishment in the United States, and solitary confinement. So to work on this project, it was very different for me than any of the projects that I just shared. I set up a PO box, and through a prison pen pal service, I wrote 7 men serving severe sentences around the country, 5 of which were on death row, and 2 of which were adults that had been sentenced to life for crimes committed at 13 and 15. and most of which were living these sentences out in solitary confinement cells that were roughly the size of a parking spot in a parking lot. So through the correspondence with these men, I ended up creating all these images that sort of attempted to show this unexpected vulnerability in their incarcerated lives, and sort of examine that mental and physical impact of a life spent in prison. This is just an image of some of this picture was taken in 2011, actually. There was about several years after this of mail that was received. But using photographs that were on their pen pal websites, their pen pal profiles, as Doug mentioned, I created these pixelated portraits of these men. And I did this creating this algorithm that would essentially strip down the original image into bigger or smaller pixelation levels based off of how long they were in prison and how long they were alive, like what that ratio was. So this particular portrait is reflecting 13 out of 32 years. Am I going like way too fast? I feel very self-aware of like how much content I'm gonna share. Okay, so to move on with my steamrolling, another big component to this project was using appropriated materials sought out through Google image searches or Flickr accounts, or just really any means to construct landscapes of memories that were shared in letters by these men. And I constructed them layer by layer in thin opacities to account for the number of years each had spent in prison. So it's not quite an algorithm, but it's another process of sort of mutating an image or impacting an image's quality to reflect my ideas on how long-term incarceration impacts one's sense of self and memory, right? So I often show these in pairs of at least two to show this sort of collapse of layering that is meant to symbolize time passing. These landscapes were often places of significance or places they felt they might not ever see again. And in my case, writing these men, maybe two were able to see these places again. But in creating these landscapes, my goal was just, again, to touch on this idea of loss of memory and self. And it came about through these written correspondences. I did often write and prompt them with some writing exercises to kind of engage them with thinking about homesickness or loss. And then from that, I would use that as a spoke, then send these images to them. And it was sort of this strange, slow exchange because it was all at the pace of carceral spaces that control everything coming and going. So again, sort of just to illustrate, this image and this image were made for one individual, and they're made with separate amounts of layering to show this passage of time in this individual's life. And I'm just going to go through some of these. This one is, maybe it's not easy to tell on a screen, but he had spent, at the point of me making this, 19 out of his 32 years in prison. He's actually a child in this picture, and his jumpsuit goes like almost all the way to his, it goes well past his elbow because it was far too big for him. And here's the image I made for him, which was literally just the simplicity of sky without bars. That's all he wanted. And so I created 19 of these images for him based off of the 19 years he had spent in prison so far. And I sent all of them these images, but something that I really loved that unfolded out of this particular instance was that he taped them up in his solitary confinement cell that didn't have a window and said that now he had a window. So I just found that really moving. Here's just a few more of these. This guy's in Georgia, was in Georgia. And his memory was of the forest surrounding his childhood home in rural Georgia, and where he used to go hunting as a kid or just escape. And one more example. This is 17 out of 35 years. This is an individual that was at San Quentin. And he described the caves by the beach that they used to all hang out and party in down in Southern California. So obviously, I think a huge part of this project for me, and I don't fully get to grasp what it was for people on the other end of this correspondence, but for me, it felt like this really interesting exchange of imagination, right? So I'm writing and I'm sharing my life with them, and they're writing and they're sharing their life with me, and we both sort of have to imagine what that looks like because we can't physically see it. And so in this case, these landscapes are totally fictional. I have no idea of the accuracy, but that was part of what was intriguing to me, was that use of imagination that comes out of not having access. Aside from the landscapes and the portraits, a big part of what I did was take instruction through letters or suggestions through letters about things I could make or buy or seek out. And so I made this this is a jump rope, and it was described by someone serving a death row sentence in Mississippi, who said every time new bed sheets were issued, he would hide the old ones and he would rip them into long strips and he would braid a jump rope. And then he had a way to exercise. And it was always confiscated because it looks like a noose. But he did it repeatedly. So I made this jumpsuit, I made this jump rope, and I sent him images of my attempt to make what he had described to me, and he sent back a note saying that I was awful at it and that I did a horrible job, and that I ripped the fabric in the wrong direction, which is what caused all the fraying. And then this was described by one of my pen pals, in the man in Georgia, who became an artist behind bars. And again, something that came out of scarcity, which I think a lot of us can kind of relate on a very minuscule level. Like during COVID, the level of scarcity like impacted our ways of being creative, right? And so if you think about that just in this like much more profound way, this scarcity creates all this ingenuity behind bars. And so this individual would buy candy from the commissary and he would dilute it with water and make a watercolor set. So this is with Skittles and M&Ms, so that he could paint. And then I made other things. There's so much work behind this. It's impossible to talk about very quickly, but a tremendous amount of it's on my website, so you can see more there, but I'm kind of giving little snippets. This is a piece that I made modeled after a man that I was writing in solitary confinement in Northern California, where he said he used to put Diego Rivera posters on his wall, but every day that he went out of his cell to exercise in another like indoor cell, they would go in and they would sort of rip everything apart and flip his mattress over and like just check that he wasn't hiding anything. And he got so sick of replacing those pieces on the wall that he just kind of gave up. And so I made this piece that's nowhere in comparison to that experience, but I taped a Diego Rivera poster to this wall, and then I would just tear it down repeatedly over a duration of time. And then I photographed what was left on the wall. Yeah, and then they sent me drawings and postcards that I will share a few of. Sorry, I just had a security pop up on my laptop. So this is one of them. This one was drawn by someone that had been incarcerated since he was 13. And I've always just really been moved by this drawing because of the depiction of what a phone looks like to someone that hasn't been out in the world in so long that they don't know what they look like right now. But yeah, and then here's an illustration from the point of view of this man serving time in a death row cell in Georgia. Another drawing. And then this is a tally sheet that was made by someone serving in Mississippi. I don't know how clear it looks on your end, but he tallied up all these different things that he experienced in 2009 and 2010, including like New Year's resolutions, or like how many times he read the Bible. There's one for rule violations or journal pages written. And in the bottom, it talks about how many letters and stamps he used every year. Because the way that he passed time was to have at least one pen pal, I think, for every day of the month. And so my day was the 12th. He wrote me a letter every day on the 12th. So that is sort of this very quickly paced description of this project that's like honestly very hard for me to summarize, because it was just a very challenging project for me to work on that in hindsight, I was so naive to enter the way that I entered it, because I don't think I realized the magnitude of what was possible in unfolding in that time period. Because out of the 7 men that I wrote, one man was released in 2010. So he spent 15 years in prison and was released at 30. He went in at 15 years old. One of the first men the first man I wrote with was executed a couple months after I started writing him. I'm trying to think. I had, in 2012, I lost another pen pal in Mississippi who had spent over 15 years on death row. And then after I wrapped the project, which wrapped around 2014, I later heard that the man in Georgia that I wrote with was executed in 2018. The man that went in at age 13, I was so happy to hear that he was released. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole at 15 for trying to escape a juvenile hall space in Southern California. And he was released early, but he had spent 20 years in an adult supermax prison in solitary confinement before that happened. And then most recently, my pen pal at San Quentin, because every year I Google and check, I try to check on people to see where they're at. And my pen pal at San Quentin most recently died of COVID complications in a prison that was heavily impacted by the pandemic. It was all over the news. So that's like just the magnitude of what can unfold when you engage with material this heavy is that, and it's something that you can't predict when you start, but I don't regret it. It is something I hold dear to my heart, and it opened up a lot of things for me as an artist that I've continued to explore. And so to give you an idea of how this work translates in spaces in ways that I hope are educational for other people and meaningful, at the High Museum, we had sort of this octagonal, I can't say that word, gallery space, and each portrait was 40 by 50 and sort of like looming large, looking in, almost like a panopticon space, right? Looking in, and in the middle was just a huge vitrine of every letter and drawing that I had received. To put this like human component back in, for people to really like engage with this content in this case, and look up and engage with these portraits. And what was really amazing about that is that the High Museum partnered with the Department for Juvenile Justice in Georgia, and they brought incarcerated youth from all over the state to the museum to do art workshops and artist talks with them. And I got to lead a few of those tours, and it was really moving. Yeah, it's really intense to see small children in prison uniforms that look like private school uniforms, each with their own guard, like armed guard. I don't know, it was a very surreal experience. A few other installation shots. There's Crest Gallery on the left, it was a solo show I had, and the Wignall Museum on the right. And in one of my exhibitions, we were able to build a solitary confinement cell that was built to scale, modeled after my pen pal, who was in one for 20 years. And you could enter this space, you can see on the right, you could enter this space and sort of try to experience that, even though it's nowhere near, obviously, the actual experiences. Sorry. And then, as Doug mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be able to self-publish this. I got a grant to do it. I feel like the book is probably the easiest way for anybody to enter this work, because it allows for all the text that I need. It allows for more narrative and explanation. And I'm hoping at some point I'll be able to print a second edition of this book. My first edition was very small, so I ran out of them pretty quickly. But yeah, and then as Doug mentioned, Parting Words, this is from Parting Words. So through all of those experiences building to make Black's Day, Black's the Night, Parting Words was born, right? So one of the first men that I wrote with for that project was executed within months of corresponding. His first response to me was, I have an execution date. I don't know if you'll want to write with me. And I did. And so we wrote until we no longer could, but he was in Texas. And so when I just, in this sort of moment of trying to understand what was happening, I ended up on the website, the Texas Department for Criminal Justice website, where they keep this intense archive of every individual on death row and every individual they've executed. And it includes information about their age, their race, their education level, their height, just very bizarre amount of information. And the crimes that they had been convicted of, which I think is such an interesting thing that I've had to become more acquainted with, in that when I say crimes convicted of and not crimes committed, it's because in the case of the death penalty, there are so often so many misunderstandings of what goes on in terms of who's there in that population and if they deserve to be there or not. So in a lot of situations where people don't have money, they're asked to take plea bargains, say they're guilty, they'll guarantee them a lesser sentence, and a lot of times it backfires. There's a lot of different ways that people end up on death row. But yeah, mistaken identity. I've had numerous pen pals of mine had described appealing their case the entire time they were there. So yeah, not to get into that for too long, because I'm not a legal expert. I'm an artist that is trying to digest and tackle these topics, but it is something that I'm intrigued by, that I wouldn't have known if I hadn't have dove into this type of work. So to go back to what I, my big digression, it was with like the information that was on this website that I was able to create a body of work that touched on these ideas of capital punishment in the United States and attempt to sort of humanize these individuals that had been pretty much discarded, right? So I recently got to show this work for the first time as a solo exhibition at the South Bend Museum of Art, but there's 570 plus inmates that have been executed since 1976. And to make these, I used this software that would generate algorithms so that I could plug in their portrait and then I could plug in their last words and it would create these patterns that I lost control over. These are just a few images from this project. And one thing I've noticed, I mean, the thing that was really hard for me, it was the volume. So when I came across this project idea, there were already, I think, like over 400 people that have been executed. So in my artist mind of like, I need to make this portrait of all of them, I had to backpedal to 1976, which was intensely challenging for so many reasons. And so in doing that, I had to take these large breaks where I would just dive into the work and then I would take a couple months off and then dive into the work and then take a couple months off because it became too dark. And so that is something I just wanted to mention just due to the volume involved in this project. Yeah, I don't remember what year I finally caught up, but now it's like I update once a year because it's still a work that I continue to make. But yeah, updating once a year is a lot easier than catching up with 400 plus individuals. I don't know how well these read on your end, but there are so many really moving and beautiful texts that that I came across when making this work. This is the one Doug shared. This is what it looks like when it's installed in various spaces. This was in Tennessee. It was the first time I got to show all of them. And then this was pretty recently, well, like a year ago or so, at Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. They did an exhibition called Right of Return. And they just filled this space with artists that were either formerly incarcerated or artists that were making work about incarceration. It was a very unique space to work in. And then this is the South Bend show that I just had earlier this year, which was amazing for me. I've never been given a solo space to show work this heavy. And they gave me the entire gallery to do it. So, yeah, and something that I've always tried to do, which you saw a little bit of earlier, is to create sort of educational component. And so when I show work in various states, I try to include like connection to their own incarcerated populations. And so in South Bend, Indiana, we created this cell to invite people in, and we also invited people to engage with the books that were up there that are like educational books about capital punishment, but also we had lists of the types of books needed for donations. And we invited the museum goers to donate books that would go to Books Behind Bars programs so that incarcerated individuals could have access to books and educational material. And I've done that in several states, which I always find rewarding. So to switch to another body of work, because I've made several other bodies of work that unpack these ideas of mass incarceration and capital punishment. California, Florida, and Louisiana. So I'm going to share a few images from a project I called Golden State, and that is made up of 26 portraits illustrating the largest death row population in the United States, which is in my home state of California. And it was created using mugshots for the entire 746 predominantly male death row inmates, and it was organized and compiled by last name. And then it was layered in these thin opacities where I lined up the tip of the nose and the pupils to create essentially an alphabet. I created a portrait for every letter of the alphabet. And so in these portraits, it's just this interesting thing that unfolded, again, not by an algorithm, but just by facts, right? The more densely populated this, like a particular letter would be, the more like this gold backdrop would disappear and it would turn into these institutional grays and blues of prisons. And so in making this, I was really intrigued by learning how, or essentially like being from California, I'd always wanted to make work about California's death row, but it wasn't until I think 2016 that California voters had voted to speed up the death penalty and not abolish it, which horrified me, like thinking my state's like this liberal state. And I was like, wait, what? What did everyone just vote on? When they did that, LA Times put out this huge interactive article saying like, essentially, these are the men you just voted to execute faster. And it finally released all this information that I had been really wanting access to make work about for a long time. And so I quickly like downloaded and made use of this imagery, or downloaded it to have access to it later. So I was interested in this like sheer volume, but I was also interested in this unfolding that I couldn't really control, which was this undeniable racial makeup that surfaced in making these. And then in researching the population of death row in California, it's like over 65% are minorities. And so just thinking about that and thinking about these composite portraits and what they represent was something that I was interested in. And then this is an installation of all 26 of them. It was up in New York, I think like 2 years ago. And then last but not least, in terms of incarceration that I want to talk about, I wanted to share this installation that was commissioned by Nuka Museum in New Orleans in 2019. And it's since gone on to travel to the Ford Foundation in New York, MSU Broad Museum in Michigan, and now, of course, with you guys. But the piece was drawn from several aspects of interview material that was shared by my partner for this exhibition. All the artists that were commissioned for this were partnered with formerly incarcerated women to sort of collaborate. And so in working with my partner, this formerly incarcerated woman named Tanya, she described unpaid labor as garment work, like she had to do while incarcerated in Louisiana, which if you have a sentence of under 5 years, if I'm remembering that part correctly, they don't have to pay you. So you're actually it's just straight up prison labor, and you're not being compensated in any way for it. And something that I found really ironic when she was sharing this information in this interview was that she was forced to make prison uniforms for other prisons, which is just, it just like, I couldn't wrap my head around it. And so I became really interested in this idea of mass production of consumer goods made through mass incarceration. And for those who haven't seen the installation or who can't, It includes this custom wallpaper that you see on the backdrop here. That's the Louisiana state flower, the magnolia. And then it contains these portraits of women in prison uniforms, and they're either depicted with their children or soon expecting. But these pieces were constructed pretty meticulously out of hundreds of catalog images of prison uniforms. And what my main focus was in making these was this statistic that Nuka Museum had given me, that 80% of incarcerated women in the state of Louisiana are the sole caretakers of children under the age of 18. And that really troubled me because it means a lot of children are going into foster care systems, which is notorious for being a pipeline to further incarceration. And so in making these, I was referencing these traditional studio portraits with my portrait backdrop. But in taking this on, this new type of family portraiture, I was obscuring and placing people in these sort of generic spaces, these generic visitation rooms. And in doing that, I just was trying to comment on the struggle to maintain identity and personal space. And sort of also to touch on this potential prescribed future for the children of these incarcerated parents. And so these are a few more. But I spent a year making this work, and then it's just been traveling since. Here's one detail that shows how I was doing this. It was kind of mind-numbing. I don't actually know how I did it in hindsight, but that's how a lot of my work is. I just go into these work trances. And but to give you an idea, like these are where I was sourcing this imagery from. I was requesting these prison supply catalogs, and then I was creating sort of these paint palettes in order to go in and make this imagery. So yeah, that I don't know how we are on time. Doug, do you know how we are on time? I put this as a little placeholder in case I was totally out of time. I have other stuff if we're not.
I would defer a little bit to Emily.
Okay.
I think we have a little time, and then we can open up for a couple questions.
Okay. I really was just going to, because I think people are interested in it. Doug touched on it. This idea of spending so much time looking at people who have lost control over their spaces, lost control over their own lives. And then in no way is it a direct comparison, because it pales in comparison. But when COVID hit, I mean, I live in Santa Clara County, and we were the first region of the United States to go into a very severe lockdown, where if you were outside, you were like being questioned what you were actually doing outside. And it was really surreal and stressful to navigate, to suddenly try and comprehend this loss, right? Over everything. And it was very scary times, as I'm sure you all had your own versions of. But my way of channeling my anxiety while being stuck in an apartment, a 340 square apartment by myself, was to start making self-portraits out of the only materials I had on hand. And I didn't really have anything on hand at Stanford University. We have these amazing, gorgeous art studios that we get to work out of. Even though they're individual spaces with their own door and no shared communal space, we were quickly told that we had a couple hours to pack what we needed out of them on the day that the lockdown was announced. So we were given a couple hours to scramble out of those studios and take whatever we needed to work remotely from any other location. And so in that rush, I just like grabbed this like crappy office printer and a huge pack of like Sanotype material that I had that I was experimenting with. I didn't even know why. I like took the most random stuff in hindsight. And then I just scrambled over to my apartment and I got stuck in there and like about 2 weeks later, I just got so anxious and bored that I just decided to make a self-portrait. And I didn't think it was going to be much past that one unique experience, but I ended up finding it quite rewarding. And so the next day I did it again, and then I did it again, and then I ended up doing it for 377 days straight. And so these are a few of these images. I'll just leave this on while I talk about it, because it's too fast, but it is for the pace of how insane we all felt. But so what I did during this time was I was thinking a lot about like scarcity and consumerism, just because we were all forced to think about it. People were hoarding hand sanitizer. You couldn't buy toilet paper. It was just such a weird time. And so I was thinking a lot about those things, and I was thinking about what I have on hand and resourcefulness. And I was just making these weird armors out of like trash and household goods every day. And so it ended up evolving like in numerous ways, because I moved from the apartment I was in Palo Alto to a temporary apartment in Southern California, back to Palo Alto. Then I was caretaking my father, who fell ill. And it was just like such a ride of different experiences that the work shifts like fairly frequently into what I was looking at, because at first I'm looking at these like modes of like armor and hiding. But then I go through all like a couple other things where it becomes sort of about like trying, and I don't have good examples of all of these things. I'm just like talking freely about what's in the 377, but like there were moments where I was really aware of how much I was hiding, that I tried to force myself not to hide anymore. And so that was a challenge, because I never followed my own rules in that. But yeah, essentially it just became this project that took a life of its own. And as Doug mentioned, it's going to be a book, which is wild, because all 377 images are going to be in the book. It's going to be this really chunky book. But yeah, it's taken on these different installation styles as well. Right now it's at the Eleanor Wilson Museum at Hollins University. There's about 200 of them there. There's another 100 of them at San Francisco State University. And then this is an installation that I did at Stanford, where I took 4 projectors facing in on each other, and they all were just rotating so that you couldn't really keep track of anything. And instead of allowing anyone to look at the portraits, I stacked them in this big unraveling mess, which is what they were doing on their own, because they were all printed on cotton, and they were fraying all the time, especially as the year went on. So yeah, that's what the installation at the museum in Virginia looks like. And that's what it looked like in my studio as I was making them at Stanford and putting them up. When I was allowed access back in, I installed these. Yeah, and then here is the book cover. But I just wanted to touch on that. There's so many other things I could talk about, but I'm super aware of the time. For the sake of this recording, and just because I like to throw this stuff out there, to pedal back a little bit, I like to end on some statistics that I've found throughout the making of all these projects I've done over the years. But yeah, so essentially leave you with this idea of knowing, right, that over 2 million people in the United States are in prison on any given day. And over 93% of them are men. 70% are people of color, and 1 in 4 veterans make up these populations. And then thinking about life sentences, there are over 17,000 people serving them for nonviolent crimes, including drug offenses, and over 9,000 juveniles serving 50 years to life. These are just things I like to think about, especially in context of making my work about masculinity. If 93% of the prison population are men, and there's veterans in the mix, and there's, you know, populations that are just being infringed upon, like in unfair, imbalanced ways. It's just something I like to like dwell on for a second in terms of the lecture content. So I'll just leave that slide up, and yeah, but that is what I have, and hopefully it wasn't too too much in too short amount of time. But yeah, if anybody has any questions or however you want to lead this, Emily or Doug, I'm open to whatever.
Emily, you might want to unshare your screen. So you can-
I can unshare.
Good. You up like this. There you are. I'm going to turn to my students behind me and see if I have a question. And if you do, if you can come up here and drop yourself down in front of the laptop, and then it's a question.
This is the first time I've
You're
zoomed
being a little
into a
shy.
classroom.
What? So,
Hello, my name is
Hello.
Grace. You kind of already addressed this. I looked at your work a little bit last night, and I was especially looking at the incarcerated people with their like final words, or if they had any final regards. And you kind of already addressed that you felt like you were a little naive going into it, and you didn't realize how hard it was going to be on you. And so that's kind of was my first thought when I saw it for the first time last night, is how did that affect you in the long run? And was it really hard on you? And was it hard to keep going, or was there a point where you wanted to stop?
Yes, all of them. Yeah, it was very hard on me, in a way that I was so busy thinking about how important I felt the work was in order to be seen by others, that I didn't really properly gauge the toll it would take on me to make this work to share with others. And so in hindsight, I think I did dip in and out of some, like, I don't want to say like any like hardcore depression, but I definitely felt the weight of this. And I definitely had to take some serious timeouts, especially from parting words, because that project hit me. I mean, Black as Day, Black as Night, like gutted me, because, it's like I was interacting with people directly that I witnessed like perished, like not witnessed,
Yeah.
like I didn't see it, but it's like I was a part of their lives when this happened. And
Yeah.
it undeniably impacted me, especially the guy that was executed in Mississippi, who I had been writing with for several years, every single month for several years. I became a witness to how his entire family was impacted by that. And it was really, really devastating. But for parting words, I think the part that really got to me was you could go in and you could read like what their statement was.
Mhm.
But then if you were like curious and felt compelled, you can go into their like this other, so there's like a couple links, like one is to them as an individual in the carceral space, and one of them is to their last statements. So you could click on the last statement, read it, but then you could click into their profile and see like all these statistics that would just kind of hit you in different ways, like their education levels, or there were so many people. There was, say, education level would be like 6th grade, or just like
I
things.
saw that. I noticed that as well.
Yeah, it's so depressing. And so it's like you're thinking about people that for whatever reasons were just like not able to experience life the way that most of us experience it. So that was one thing. But then when you start reading about crimes people are convicted of, it's like those just become like haunting. So it's like heavy on so many different levels. Yeah, I had to take a lot of breaks. And even, yeah, since making the piece for Persister, I have taken some time to work on other types of projects for sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I like Doug convincing.
I know, I'm trying to.
I love it. I can see you leaning in being like, hello.
Yeah, I know. No, they're being shy.
It's
You know,
okay.
oh, it looks like something came up in the chat. Here we go. This is from Patricia. Oh, just a comment. I find your work incredibly moving and the statistics are devastating. Which kind of leads me to a question, actually, or an observation maybe. What, and you brought it up a couple times, but that you entered this work, especially work dealing with incarceration, but aspects of other work as well, naively, you know, as you said repeatedly. And what I think about that state, which I think is an important and valid place to initiate work in, if as you realize your naivete, you take active steps to both change it, inform yourself, and I think question yourself and how you got to that state, etc., or why you were in that state, and move from it, but also make work that can also transform other people from, you know, a similar state of naivete. And your work does that admirably, and the tenacity that you show to make that transition, to make work that can address your sort of foreign position, and is really amazing. And one of the things you employ are successfully are these kind of algorithmic frameworks. They're very poignant, which is I don't usually put those two words together, poignant and algorithm. I don't think most people do. You know, most people, it's like some demonic Facebook thing or something. But in your case, you figure out a way for this kind of brute formula to open up a life. And so I don't know, there's a question there, but can you talk about how just you know, you began to use algorithms and you went from, again, a fairly traditional approach to portrait making based on likeness to portraits that really come from somewhere else?
I think a lot of it, well, first of all, I'm kind of one of those artists that just exhausts myself with exploration when I'm working on projects. I just keep trying to figure out what is the way to do this. And with all of the works running incarceration, I think something I struggled with, I think maybe subconsciously, because like now I can say it looking back, but at the time I don't know that I could have said it with clarity, but like there's a lot of protection involved, right? So it's like you're protecting people's identities because that has to play a part of it. So it's like you're talking about identity loss, but you're also preventing someone from being a target of being scrutinized by the general public when they have no control over how their image is being seen, right? And so there's that. I think there's that too. How do you address talking about individuals in spaces that represent thousands and thousands of individuals in spaces without putting their particular life on blast for everyone to scrutinize and pore over, right? So I think part of it, and at the time, I don't know that I would have had the language or all of that thought around it, but like now looking back, I feel like a lot of it is sort of like protective layers as well, algorithms to sort of protect vulnerable populations, right? But also like how can you talk about the loss of identity like, how can you talk about that when you're not able to even be near like people that are basically designated as removed from society, right? They're not, you can't approach them really. And so how do you work around that? And so I had to sort of really brainstorm like what ways could properly represent. Parting Words was sort of like an interesting, like serendipitous moment where I was really thinking about like, because originally they were just purely text pieces. I didn't have portraits involved because I didn't know how to do that. So it was just these text pieces like, I'm going to a beautiful place, or, you know, like I'm innocent, 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 and sort of these like profound statements, but I didn't know how to do anything further with them. And I was like just candidly chatting with a friend who was talking about the software that you make greeting cards with. And I just went in my little wormhole. I just like later that night was just up all night on Google, like looking for these types of softwares that generate portraits out of text until I found one. And so that was sort of like came through just chatting, which I feel like a lot of things can come out of just like candidly chatting about your work with people when you're stuck. I feel like a lot can come out of that when people kind of collectively help you brainstorm when you're stuck. But yeah. And again, I feel like I think the most important thing to relay is I was just really struck by the volume, the abundance, like the numbers, like California, like how do I make work about California's death row when there's over 700 people there? Like that's too many people to confront visually as an artist and understand what to do with. So like, how do I deal with that? And it's like, okay, how can I like condense? Like, how can I like make this more approachable for other people? And it was like, oh, well, if I sort of make these like composite portraits, I can make work about a population without revealing one individual, but sort of make it more about these spaces of collective loss.
I'm turning this way to look at.
I love that it's just this little window for me. I can peer over your shoulder.
They had to write questions for today. You got a good question.
I love like when you're actually like sitting on Zoom, it's much easier because you can just type it in quietly, right? Like here they have to like come up to the front.
Hi, I'm Shay.
Hello.
Grace kind of asked my question already, so I guess I have another one. I would say for me as like a new and upcoming photographer, most of my work is like self-reflective of like the way I grew up or like resources I had around me. So I guess my question to you is how much of your work is self-reflective in a way of like how you grew up or how you were able to like adapt to situations you were in? Like you did have the one in your apartment and the one where you did it when you were in undergrad. So I just wanted to know how much of your work is.
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, I've been having to think about this in a whole other way recently because I just finished writing my thesis for my graduate program, and it was actually really kind of a profound experience for me to think about my work in this huge arc or like a constellation, in that I never started making work about masculinity or masculine vulnerability until a male family member of mine was incarcerated, and I saw the rupture that caused. And it's like all of my work, it's like I cracked open and all of the work came out of that. So then it was like this endless exploration of maleness from my limited, because I'm not a man. So it's like as limited as I am able, or you know what I mean? It's just I'm limited. So I can never fully understand. I can only guess or attempt, right? And so, a lot of that work spoke directly out of witnessing sort of this really large rupture that unfolded in my family. And in terms of incarcerated populations, same thing, because when my own family member was there, several of them were, but one I wrote letters with all the time and I talked to on the phone all the time. And it was a similar type of thought that went into it, sort of listening to these experiences and trying to translate them in a way that I could comprehend. And so that's where a lot of the original work that fueled straight into Black is the Night, excuse me, came from. So yeah, I guess that's the experience that I come from, that I bring to it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you will.
Oh, yes.
Hello. I'm Sophie.
Hello. Hi, Sophie.
So my question is, I know that you talked about how you needed to take breaks because it was a hard subject to deal with, but I'm curious about the motivation, I guess. Like, was the motivation ever wavering because it was hard, or was it still very strong, but because it was difficult, you just had to step back and then keep going, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I actually never wavered. I never, even with Black is the Day, Black is the Night, when the project became fairly challenging pretty immediately, I just kept going. I don't know how to describe it other than I didn't really have any impulse to turn away from the subject matter or the people I was writing with. The thing that was interesting about both projects is so all the portrait work I showed you, I was making while I was doing this, because the pace of Black is the Day, Black is the Night was so slow. Like, I would get a letter and then there would be months and then I would get something else, and it was so like spaced out, just due to the way that people were able to engage, like whether they had the money for stamps or whether like the prisons confiscate things that are going in or out. And so it was really dictated by these institutions and not by either of us. So it caused this slowness that I think helped me thoughtfully like process and engage with the material. And parting words, yeah, I just took a lot of breaks. That was really intense. But I was photographing the rugby players while I was doing it. I was photographing another project that's on my website, Lucas. It's a really long-term portrait project. And I was, doing several other projects. And I think those helped me balance a bit because they were not related to the same subject matter. So I was able to, level out a little bit.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How you doing, Amy?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Doug?
Okay. I'm gonna ask one more question, and I think, we have something. So we have to leave. We have a few thank yous about sharing your work, and probably gonna wrap it up. But I wanted to bring it back quickly to Wallflower. I'm bouncing off a question from a student that I have here on my phone. He is too shy to ask,
Okay.
but Ryan.
I relate, by the way.
And I'm Wallflower. I forgot that you did it while you were in school, while you were an undergrad. That's how it began. Which is really even really impressive. And so Ryan was curious about where you got that great wallpaper. That was one question.
Okay.
I think it's absolutely great. But again, I am forever curious about what you all talked about while you were making those portraits and what that dynamic was like, in order to get those men to somehow relax in a way that is unusual, to let their guard down to a certain degree.
Well, okay, so firstly, the wallpaper and those backdrops, I became quite a hoarder of such things. And so some of them are like sheets, some of them are fabric, some of them are actual wallpapers, some of them are paper from like art supply shops that I stitched together. It was just whenever I just became sort of obsessed with like beautiful backdrops. And so everywhere I went, if I saw something, I would have to like collect it. And I still have this like abundant collection to this day from that and from other projects. But that was kind of like I just became a hoarder of the patterns. I think a lot of it was influenced also, just to kind of circle back, like it's like growing up in California, I grew up with a lot of like painting, like art history, like surrounding like classical paintings and like early American and early Dutch painting. And so it's like I kind of had this like aesthetic ingrained in the back of my head of like this like formalism or sort of regalness, you know, that you'd see in these old paintings, of like, I don't know, it was usually like these wealthy individuals that could afford to have these paintings made, and there'd just be this like beautiful ornate decorativeness to them. And I definitely think that infiltrated. But in terms of what I said, I think first of all, let me just say that they were done in a very small space. And so there was this forced intimacy that neither of us could deny. So that was there. There was also the fact that I was this like bumbling, fumbling undergrad who knew what I wanted but didn't know how to ask for it. So there was this slowness to making work because I was fumbling quite often, literally like, hold on. And so there was a slowness, and I think the slowness like really like made people relax. And we would talk a ton, and it was dictated by the light, the window light. So like I'd be shooting and the light would be glorious, and then something would happen, like it would come from behind a cloud and it would be way too bright. And we would just talk for like a half hour until it went back, and then go back into shooting. So sometimes the shoots would last for like 4 hours. We would just be chatting and going in and out of portrait making. Versus anything I've done in recent past, there's no way. You'd work with someone for maybe an hour, but you don't work for a whole half a day or anything like that. Yeah, so I think it was a slowness. I don't know if I was saying anything to them specifically. I was trying to let them like kind of go. I was trying to get them to forget I was there, which is incredibly hard to do.
Especially in a small space.
In a small space. I mean, I was like half straddling like furniture, and they were like pinned against a wall. Like the space was so small. I do always tell the story about Jake. I do think it's quite funny. When I photographed Jake, he was the first or the second portrait I ever made like that. And I didn't know him. I just was struck by him, and I was like, can you please let me shoot you? He comes over and he's wearing this like massive outfit, like gigantic robes of clothes. And I'm like, okay, I can do this. And I'm shooting on film. I'm shooting on a RZ, and I'm like, okay, just sit over here, because I'm like too shy to even like ask him for what I want. And so he's in this huge hoodie, and I make all these portraits of him in this hoodie on film that I can't afford to be like shooting endlessly. I'm shooting him on film in this huge hoodie. And then I'm like, can you take the hoodie off? And so he takes it off. He's got this huge shirt on, the sleeves go like past his elbows. And I'm like, shit. So I'm like photographing him like that again, just burning film, when I'm like, oh, I need to save my film. This art school is expensive. And then I'm like, can you take that shirt off? And he takes it off. He's got a tank top on. I'm like dying. I'm like, okay. So I photographed him with the tank top. I've gone through like 3 rolls of film. And then I'm finally like, can you just like take that off? Like I was like so like flustered and like just, and then he takes it off. And by that point, like hours had gone by. And then I get that portrait of him, right? but it took so long to get there because I was way too shy to just be like, this is the portrait project I'm working on. This is what I want from you. This is what you should expect when you come over. Instead, I was just tiptoeing and shyly navigating. And then like, you know, a couple portrait sessions later with other people, they would walk in and they would just like toss their shirt off and sit down. Like, it's like, it became more rhythmic, but in the beginning, man, I really struggled with asking for what I wanted. And I think that's also reflected in their way that they were reacting to me. I wasn't like super assertive and aggressive. I was just kind of like, okay, like, that's it.
I got it. I got it.
Yeah.
That's great. Excellent. Really great.
Anyhow.
All right. Okay. Emily.
Hey,
Thank you, Amy.
you're welcome.
And Doug. To thank Doug too for navigating this and hosting it with us. For those who are still here listening, Persister is on display through Friday, March 11th. So if you have not seen Amy's work in person, with one of her fabulous wallpaper backdrops with it that she actually hand stitched together, which, Amy, I have to tell you, we didn't actually realize the detail until it arrived. Your work arrived in the gallery, and there was a moment where we were unpacking it and we were looking at it and we were like, oh my goodness. Like you stand back and you don't realize how much work went into that and the intricacy, and then the meaning behind all of the stitched together clothing. So if you have not seen her work in person, we are open through Friday, open late on Thursday night till 8 p.m. So please come by the museum and see the exhibition Persister, Incarcerated Women of Louisiana. And it will still be traveling throughout. So they have a great website that for the exhibition, persister.info, that has information about future venues as they are added. So this is a continuing exhibition that is toured by the Newcomb Art Museum out of Tulane University in New Orleans. So again, thank you, Amy and Doug. And thank you everyone for coming, and to Doug's students for listening and sharing their questions.
I'm Doug's students.
Here, Amy. We will talk soon. I hope.
Talk soon. Maybe I'll see you in Paris one of these years.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.